Let's go ahead. So we'll be back to visit Julia Perez in a moment. I just would remind you, here's a more officially sanctioned example of street art that you'll see in Havana in the last, 5 to 10 years, right around the beginning before the pandemic and moving forward. And these are two very different visual strategies for public space, right? You've got this and you've got this, and we'll get back to this later on. This is by an artist named Maisel Lopez, and I'm very interested in this idea of using children as a kind of morale boost. I mean, I'm personally not interested, but I'm interested in this strategy because I think it can be very fruitful, but also really quote unquote problematic depending on how you're using children. Of course, innocent children mean innocence. Children have a kind of purity in their, discovering the world fresh, and you want to usually give children a very positive view of the world and not beat them down with kind of despair and depressing adult thoughts. You want them to kind of still develop a positive response to the world, even if the adults are sort of already it's kind of stuck in their kind of negativity. So it's a very interesting thing to consider, especially the way this is a tightrope walking act, in a different way compared to someone maybe taking their art directly to the street. So we'll compare these a little later. It's just something to think about. When you're commissioned to make a work of art versus taking it directly to the street. And I think the difference is really perhaps an institutional critique. You can be very, I think by definition, you're criticizing the institution because you're almost bypassing it here. And then we'll look at Banksy a little later as an example of that and how that relates to or compares to Cuba, artist in Cuba. So, when you look at revolution, this billboard, this reminds me of the style you see in animation. I can't remember what the comic strip is, but kind of reminiscent of that style. And I just think it's interesting to think about a slogan that says revolution, coming from within Cuba means a lot more than, in the United States. When I look at this picture, I think of maybe the Black Lives Matter protests back in 2020, people taking to the street, to the rooftops, maybe during the pandemic. People took to the rooftops to scream. Um, and it's very different when clamor for revolution in Cuba. That is almost, I mean, are you supporting the revolution, or are you offering an idea, like are you suggesting there should be another revolution? So I think it's the context certainly changes when you say revolution when you're talking about the United States versus Cuba. And also, when you think about street art and a city in decay, there's often a lot of voids, a lot of empty spaces, either because people aren't painting the walls or no one wants to advertise. And if a subway is decaying, you don't want to put an advertisement in a place where there's just like decay everywhere. So someone like Keith Haring, this is the artist here on the right, comes along and starts adding these whimsical cartoon-like silhouette figures onto these empty subway panels. And this is, I think, what launches his career, and he's very well known. Have you guys seen Keith Haring's artwork before? Have you seen his little figures, his kind of quirky, emotive little figures there that you see on the right? I'm sure you guys have seen it before, some of you. Hopefully you have. He's certainly someone who's sort of synonymous with the 1980s in New York. Another artist who's very much synonymous with the 1980s in New York is this guy here. Does anyone know who he is? And if not, that's great. I think it's so wonderful because I'm kind of, in a way, Basquiat is a little overcooked right now in New York City. A lot of people are kind of milking his legacy, um, in a way that kind of feels like it's just sort of kind of almost like the tourist trap version of it. Once an artist is famous, other artists kind of, I guess, kind of feed off of their career, and copy their work. And and I think Basquiat is someone who was a wonderful critique of the institution because he took his artwork directly to the walls, using graffiti. His graffiti name was Samo. And the idea of copywriting, his graffiti was part of his, I think, tongue-in-cheek irony, his critique of capitalism. And this is very much, I think, the template for a lot of artists today, kind of being a street artist, being an activist, challenging the institution. Especially, I think this leads directly to Banksy, for instance, who we'll get back into a moment. So there is a kind of vibrant sense of critiquing the institutions, and a really needed one in the West, or at least in the United States. Because the art world has become so elite and ivory tower and so moneyed, and Sotheby's and millions of dollars of artwork being sold. And I think that's where someone like Banksy comes along, and Basquiat, although of course Basquiat makes a lot of money too, and same with Banksy. But I think they offer a needed a critique of this whole institution of art, which has become so all about money and investment. So, of course, that's very different, though, than a street artist in Cuba, because they're not really criticizing the art world so much as, I think, perhaps just reacting to the overall decline of the country. So remember, we are kind of looking at apples and oranges when it comes to comparing street artists from the United States to street artists in Cuba. And of course, when it comes to other examples of art in Latin America, like Mexican muralism, that's a whole another thing, but that's for my other class. So last class, we talked about the death of Hugo Chavez, who was the leader of Venezuela, who offered Cuba a lifeline in terms of oil in exchange for doctors primarily, and his death in 2013, followed by the death of Fidel Castro in 2016, really is the end of an era and means Cuba no longer has anyone offering some kind of lower priced oil in exchange for whatever Cuba can offer in terms of resources. So Cuba is more isolated than ever economically and has no real lifeline. I think it's trying to reach out to African countries and maybe even to China today. But of course, that all comes with a cost. There's no like free lunch, right? So Cuba has to offer something. And of course, now it has a lot of, if you read the Wall Street Journal article, you learn that it has a lot of debt that it hasn't paid off. And imagine someone asking you for money, and you find out that person who's asking you for money already owes 20 other people $100. Well, you're going to think twice about giving that person money because you know they're never going to pay you back. So that's the real dilemma with, in many ways, with Cuba, with wanting money from other countries and wanting some investment, but other countries not feeling like it's a good, safe bet for their money, and so they'll invest that money in Jamaica or maybe in Florida or maybe in Mexico. So that's part of the dilemma with Cuba, which is not 100% Cuba's fault. Of course, the U.S. embargo, aka the blockade, definitely scares many countries away from investing in Cuba. But I think, as the Wall Street Journal article said, it's a little too simplistic just to blame the United States. Um, which is not to say that you can't blame the United States to a degree for leading Cuba down the road it's already been on, for that leads to revolution. But that said, the country definitely uses the United States to prop up its own sort of status quo. And you can blame the United States, but that's not necessarily going to attract foreign investment. So that's the real dilemma Cuba faces today, and why a lot of people are leaving Cuba, because just aren't jobs in Cuba. And if you do have a job, you might have a hard time getting to work because there's no fuel. So you still see a lot of these relics from the Cold War, and this kind of almost like the obsolete language of the Cold War, still very much kind of part of the landscape, visual landscape. These propaganda posters that you see in Havana. It says, "Señores imperialistas, no les tenemos absolutamente ningún miedo." So no, we don't have any fear of you whatsoever, of yelling at Uncle Sam. So this kind of anti-U.S. rhetoric kind of serves to prop up the government and legitimize the government, and there's some truth to it. But I think the reality of Cuba falling apart in the foreground with these posters that are very aggressive and strident and anti-US somewhat seem out of step. They seem out of like there's some incongruity between the sort of spirit of the posters and the spirit of the foreground, especially, when you look at the kind of the city falling apart in the foreground. We'll see some examples of that in a moment. So it's revolution, yes. Fidel, always Fidel. So Fidel, you don't actually, to his credit, you don't see his face everywhere in Cuba. You see more Che Guevara. There are some cases, but look at how old Fidel here is here. He's almost like this, in the twilight of his, in his 80s here. And to say Fidel forever, is definitely kind of like well, nothing lasts forever. And, you do want someone to replace Fidel. And so in a way, there's kind of like, this is almost like an admission that there's no one to replace him. And I think during even the first Trump era, there was some kind of I'm not sure if this was meant to be. This is obviously in the United States, so maybe comparing Fidel and Trump. So I'm not sure who did this, but just one example of kind of talking about dictators. And here in Cuba, you see Che Guevara quite a bit. This is almost like a Raul Martinez. I think someone's writing about him, so you can see that kind of Raul Martinez has definitely become part of the permanent part of the Cuban visual landscape. But a lot of these propaganda, murals, what do you ever want to call them, are falling apart, need paint, and paint is not the first thing you're going to invest in when food is short, is scarce. So, they feel almost like they're out of step with, the foreground, especially in a case like this, that spirited moment of revelry at the peak of the movement against Batista during the 1950s. Contrast with the people in the background who maybe are old enough to remember that moment, but have, completely forgotten about it as they focus on their day-to-day needs. Um, so luchar contra lo imposible y vencer, to fight against the impossible and to win. This kind of sense of belligerence, a permanent state of warfare in Cuba definitely characterizes these posters. And I think that's, something really, it's powerful, but it's also kind of one-dimensional. And I don't think it's necessarily very artistic so much as propaganda, pardon me, propagandistic, and certainly meant to maybe raise morale and legitimize Fidel. Everything's fine. That's basically what it says here. I think this is the funniest one for me, just because it is so kind of like one note, and clearly like everything's going great. Don't worry about anything. Seems to be a real kind of like just sort of a putting a happy spin on things, right? So this is the reality. Imagine that poster facing this, in the corner, and when one building's falling apart, other buildings fall apart next, and it's really a cascade. And so rubble, not no resources for restoring these buildings. Now, some of these buildings, you don't need to restore them because they're not serving a purpose. So you maybe prioritize certain neighborhoods, prioritize certain structures, and just let some places fall apart. And you do see places like this in the United States, not quite like this, but just go to any Amtrak station near Baltimore, near Philadelphia, and you'll see kind of gutted buildings that are just sort of doomed to fall down one day. And so this isn't like completely foreign to us, maybe not in Florida, but certainly in other parts of the country. But of course, this is much worse than any of that. And a real sort of eyesore for either tourists or, of course, for Cubans who have to live around this kind of decay day to day. And this is, broken windows theory. The idea of broken windows is that any sort of decline in public space is a will generate a kind of an inner sense of decline in terms of your respect for your community, your neighborhood, your country. So this outward decline is something that will slowly kind of seep into people's kind of sense of alienation from their own environment, right? Um, Feeling like the government's not really doing its basic, able to accommodate its basic or service, do its basic, offer basic services, right? And if the buildings are falling apart, just imagine what the sewer systems are like, the electricity grid is like, and everything else, right? So someone, I think the artist here is comparing Kiev to Havana. And of course, Fidel's death doesn't add anything except kind of raise more questions about the future of Cuba, because there's really no one with that kind of Fidel authority except perhaps his brother to kind of steer the ship. So I think sadly, what's filled the void in the wake of Fidel's death is a lot of corrupt Cuban officials. And in a way, Fidel's death is kind of like Porfirio Diaz in Mexico, who, if you take my Mexican muralism class, you'll learn he was in power for something like 30 years. Fidel, I think, was in power for even longer, like 1960 to like 40 something years. So, if Mexico offers any kind of sense of what might happen, Porfirio Diaz's death led to the Mexican Revolution. Well, Fidel Castro died about 10 years ago. There hasn't been another revolution in Cuba, so maybe there won't be any. Maybe it'll just be a slow kind of filling of that void, that vacuum. But I would not be surprised if in the next 5 to 10 years you hear about some kind of fomenting change taking place in the eastern part of Santiago, eastern part of Cuba. So these street artists, I think, on one hand, are filling the void left where paint and on decaying buildings and streets that are falling apart. But I think they're also aware of the power of social media and the ability to take their art to the street, but then also take their street art to the internet. And that means they get a lot of these Cubans who have been hungry for international for travel. Well, even if you can't travel, the closest thing to it is to let your artwork travel to other countries and maybe have some sense of hope, because at the very least you're in dialogue with people, and that definitely, if it doesn't nourish your stomach, it nourishes your soul to know that you matter, right? To know that the world cares about you, that you matter to the world enough for people to take interest in your artwork. It has some, I think, value, even if it's just symbolic. So I do think you have to kind of look at the fact that the government has now reached a point where it sees anything like street art as a net benefit to the country, because one, it adds maybe a little bit of value, cultural value, adds to interest in Cuban art. And as long as the artists don't cross any, invisible lines, then I think everyone wins, everyone benefits. But I think those lines might have to be crossed eventually in order for, artists to kind of perhaps go from being symbolically valuable to the country to literally advancing, maybe inspiring, revolution, or inspiring people to perhaps push for changes, in local government, and or perhaps maybe just offer a kind of a dialogue with tourism, with tourists, that's different than maybe the official script that the government wants you to follow, which is, of course, the United States sucks and they're imperialists, and Cuba's rightly in this sort of militarized footing against the United States. Well, that's very much like the revolutionary propaganda. And, I think an important question for your papers that you're writing is, within the revolution, outside the revolution, whether the artwork needs to be in the revolution, and what about self-expression? What about the artwork we see today? Is this within the revolution? Is this like an internal self-correcting that takes place, or is this kind of outside the revolution, and this is like some kind of change that's taking place outside of the parameters, or the outside of the kind of system of the revolution? So, like I said earlier, I think, in fact, this is more of just something that happens inevitably in any place where there's a lot of decline. You have these empty spaces. If the government doesn't have the resources to police everyone, it's not going to have the resources to micromanage, this kind of artistic output. Like in a city like New York, there's a police force dedicated to going after vandalism and graffiti, and they'll go on Instagram and they will hunt you down. I know a few friends who got arrested. I didn't do street art, but I know some street artists in New York who got arrested for street art because the city micromanages such things, because they know once you allow a little street art, a lot of other artists will feel like, okay, it's okay, and then you get this big sort of upheaval in with street art. Whereas I think, and likewise in Havana, I think it's reached a point where there just isn't the kind of will, the political will to stamp out all of this, and I think, again, it's only a net positive as long as artists kind of don't cross the line and maybe start criticizing the government too directly. And I think there is it's a little too unfair to expect artists to be super political, revolutionary, when you might be better off serving the people by just showing some sympathy, showing empathy, showing some compassion, holding up a mirror. So, I think in some cases, being too political makes you sort of lose any real value that you might offer otherwise. And so I think politics can be very tricky, and there are cases when being political is really valuable. But I think, as an artist, you can be political without addressing politics, right? You can offer value to the community, to yourself, to the world, without necessarily using propaganda, or Che Guevara, or Fidel Castro, or Donald Trump, or whatever, because in a way, like, as an artist, there's still more value sometimes to be gained by just reaching out to the person on the street and saying, I feel your pain, kind of thing, right? And so there is a kind of a lot more value than just in politics. And of course, in Cuba, where everything is about Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, it's almost like, so here's what it reminds me of. So I have the head of the department here in I won't say where. a lot of his art is just like magazine supermodels, and he paints paintings of supermodels and adds like pictures, adds like skeletal elements where it looks like the supermodels are kind of almost turning into skeletons. And I get it. It's like combining like the supermodel women with the skeleton implies there's sort of like it's ephemeral, it's fleeting, and all that. But when you look at his artwork, it feels just like I'm just looking at magazine pictures of supermodels, and it feels very cliche and like it feels like something I see all the time anyways. And that's, I think, the analogy here. If you're an artist and you're doing pictures of Fidel Castro and Che Guevara or anything political, it will resemble all that other stuff you're seeing all day long. And so the audience, the public at large might just be like, oh, that's more of the same. And I think the same pitfall might be with digital art if you don't print it out or if you don't take it from on screen to on a wall. When people see another screen, they're just like, oh, the screen is like, I see it all the time. I want to see something that's not, photons, for instance. So I think that's another part of the tightrope walking act when it comes to street artists in Cuba. Now, 2 + 2 = 5 is one of the artists here. Um, and, this, for instance, is a commissioned work probably for tourists to see on their drive on the Malecon. This is a famous, I think, singer from Cuba, the one on the, not suspended from the wall, but the subject matter here. But compare that to, street art here. Now we're literally at ground level. So I think, the fact that this is painted on a wall with someone suspended from a rope really kind of implies this is, up above, high up for artists, for people to see from a car, from the roadside, monumental scale icon of Cuban cultural history versus now we're at ground level, a typical Cuban. There's nothing real flattering about this subject, kind of somewhat overweight with no shirt on, with tattoos, not at all necessarily what the government might choose as their iconic Cuban. And nevertheless, I think that's why I think it's so powerful because it's not meant to be this sort of anything more than just a day-to-day typical person, a Cuban walking around with no shirt on. And I think, the tattoos are a really wonderful metaphor for just art, right? To cover yourself with tattoos is to express yourself, to claim your own body and your own autonomy. So, in a world where you can't necessarily say whatever you want, to put tattoos on your body is a powerful way to sort of bypass those restrictions. So I think even just that is really powerful. But also to take your shirt off, to walk around with those tattoos visible, maybe is something you can't do except in, artistic form here. Of course, holding up a heart, that's kind of like love and the message of love. It's very sort of ground level, literally eye level here. So I think you kind of have to just adjust your evaluation here and appreciate these really subtle small choices and how big they are. The fact that he's standing on at ground level, and let's just look at the backdrop. I think that's partly why, um, you know, when the backdrop becomes so sort of decomposed, anything that you add artistically is only going to enhance the background. So I think that's really important thing to remember here that the cityscape has declined as to a point where nobody was going to criticize an artist for painting something as long as they don't cross the line. And that's what I think is so beautiful about these examples is these artists are finding very clever kind of ways of expressing themselves without necessarily using politics or using like kind of language or visual language that might be too political, and yet they're still being political, right? But they're being political in a different way, in a more kind of humanitarian way rather than a kind of aggressive US imperialism, Fidel Castro kind of, they're not using propaganda basically to confront propaganda. They're using kind of a, art, right? Like poetry, visual poetry, self-expression, um, taking the tools of your own expression and taking it to the street is a kind of way of maybe marking territory, but it's obviously much more than that, right? Marking territory is part of the value of street art, but I think reclaiming public space for your own self-expression is another part of that territorialism. And then, of course, adding subject matter that's not just necessarily about communicating with other street artists, but communicating with the public at large. That's a whole nother step forward. So I think here, you can't really say Basquiat's just communicating with the street artist. I think there's his subject matter suggesting a bigger dialogue beyond just the other street artist, and instead that he's criticizing the institution of art by taking it to the street. And so I think here in Cuba, the closest kind of connection to that would be bypassing the galleries, bypassing the museums, taking your art directly to the street so that you can express what everyone, all the other Cubans are feeling, which is, well, in this case, I think, maybe a sense of reacting to the pandemic and the food shortages. And of course, have you ever heard of has anyone ever heard 2 + 2 = 5? Does anyone know where that originates? Does it ring a bell, as they say? Ring my bell, ring my bell. So yeah, 2 + 2 = 5 comes from 1984, and it's a scene in 1984, the book by George Orwell, a dystopian future, totalitarian future, where someone basically the totalitarian middle person tortures someone to the point where the torturee, the person being tortured, is willing to accept that 2 + 2 = 5, in spite of course, the truth, which is it equals 4. Once you can convince someone to speak untruth and accept it as truth, you basically succeeded at brainwashing them inside and out. So to make your signature 2 + 2 = 5 is almost like a comment about the dystopian state of reality in Cuba. But of course, to say 2 + 2 = 5 instead of saying we live in a dystopia is the whole point of the tightroping walk. If you say we live in a dystopia, Fidel Castro sucks, um, that might get you into trouble. But if you say 2 + 2 = 5, you're kind of saying the same thing, but using kind of deflection and metaphor or literary kind of references to say the same thing. So that's a great example of how you can be political without being too propagandistic, right? Of course, he's sitting here using a remote control, and he's wearing a mask. The mask for me is straight out of the Zapatista playbook. The Zapatas were the movement against Zapatistas were movement against landlessness in southern Mexico, very much in the spirit of Zapata, the leader of one of the leaders of the Mexican Revolution. So the mask itself, I think, implies kind of the anonymity of revolutionary, but it's not like he's Che Guevara. It's almost like using the mask ironically to hide your identity as an artist, but also to say that you're a revolutionary. I think you also have to think about how it relates to the use of the mask during the pandemic. But I think ultimately it's really, hiding your identity as part of being sort of an artist is, I think, part of the institutional critique here. Now, sitting there watching television is important. He holds a remote control because I think the idea there is like television is a great way to keep people numb. I think you could make a good argument that social media is used to numb us as people, to keep us content, to keep us from maybe criticizing the government. And this is true all over the world, probably true in the United States, in Iran, in China, keeping people focused on superficial things like appearance or likes, or people focused on comparing yourself to others who has more money, or materialism, gobbling up consumer things keeps us perhaps, numb and from taking to the streets. Depending on where you are, that might be a very effective strategy to prevent people from protesting, like especially this horrible idea of not feeding people enough food so that they don't have enough energy to take to the streets. And I think that's what's going on in Cuba. So showing someone changing the television channel almost implies or almost creates a visual connection to that use of television as a tool for people controlling people, right? Here he's talking, it says 5 CUC, that's the local Cuban peso equivalent, and a comment on like the two economies, the US dollar economy and the local economy for Cubans. And of course, holding up a pear, some kind of food, I think is connecting to the idea of foodlessness and scarcity of food. So clearly it's much, he's using the everyday reality of food scarcity, wanting money, hiding his identity, questioning things, of all under, you don't know who it is. They're all kind of, veiled and anonymous, and yet still something that's offering a kind of sense of holding up a mirror to the everyday Cuban and saying, yes, I'm with you. I feel the same thing that you do. And yet doing so with this sort of anonymous icon is really powerful, and really, I think, valuable. to the average person in Cuba because they look at this and they're like, yeah, I completely relate to that. And that's relating to the artwork is such a powerful thing if you want people, if you as an artist you want to offer some value. Even here, I think, it looks like a pregnant 2 plus 2 now is in a way 2 plus 2 does equal 5 now with the pregnancy. But of course, you've still got the mask, and now it's not a face of like acceptance. This is a face of like despair and worry. And then of course the thought bubble leads to what looks like a fried egg, which I think is intentional because you've got a pregnant subject thinking about a fried egg, almost as if they're going to cannibalize their own child. I think that's the suggestion here, if I'm wrong, and I'm definitely way wrong, but I think that seems to be the case. Of course, we're hidden away a little more here from street level, but I think this is really, this is a very powerful kind of icon, and very powerful, stand-in for the average Cuban, and really, I think quite a powerful statement too. So 2 plus 2 equals 5 is a really interesting artist who does seem to be pushing those boundaries. Um, and I think the Cuban government doesn't have the time or the kind of subtlety to maybe appreciate the kind of power of this message here. And it's one thing to say, "Hey, we don't have food, we're starving," and to write that down on the street and put those letters on the street, but a much more powerful thing to say that here in this form with this figure. So to make decisions about your character and what they're doing and how that relates to the audience that it's intended for. All these decisions happen in pre-production, right? Here's a quote from 2 plus 2 equals 5. I think you can read it. It's pretty self-explanatory. I don't see it like that. I believe that it can equal whatever you want it to be. So he's almost subverting or reinventing the meaning of 2 plus 2 equals 5. He's taking it from the Orwellian sense of like totalitarian despots make you believe whatever they want you to believe, and he's saying, "Oh no, I can actually sort of be the despot, the totalitarian of my own existence. And if I want 2 plus 2 equals 5, sure." So it's kind of flipping the script on the idea of kind of totalitarian control on the inside and the outside. And here he's lying down. This I can't help but think of China, the phrase lying flat, which I've heard is a lot of young people in China are, quote, lying flat as a response to the maybe perceived sense of uncertainty about the future, housing market, savings, employment. And I think that's true around the world for maybe a lot of Gen Z or millennials, feeling like there isn't a kind of real sense of return on investment of time. So you might as well, hang out, play video games, order in, and not exert yourself too much and just wait things out. And that seems to be a kind of visualization of that here. Of course, I think in this case, he's lying on the Malecon, the seawall. So, lying at that border between, the ocean, the Straits of Florida and Havana, it's almost like he's gone as far as he can go. And then he's just kind of lounging at that border, that barrier. And likewise here, it's a figure lying down staring up. It's not hard to think of, Garciandia's All You Need Is Love. I'm sorry about the wrong title in the caption, but lying down, are you now outside the revolution? Personally, I love that idea of like just lying down means that, when you're lying down, you're sleeping, you're dreaming, you are no longer kind of vertical. And so in a way, you're no longer political in a way. You've left vertical. To be vertical means you've kind of are kind of up and down oriented, heaven and hell, where when you're lying flat, you've gone from being like a vertical to being like a landscape, right? You're like a panoramic person, and you could say that's a metaphor for the fact that now your compass is no longer up and down, but maybe flat, X and Y versus Z. And so there's just something really simple and elegant and maybe potentially deeply loaded about lying flat, because once you're lying down, you're maybe in bed, or maybe maybe your eyes are closed and you're entering a dream-like state. And what about your dreams? Are your dreams within the revolution? When you're sleeping, are you still Cuban? Are you still a revolutionary? Are you still, are you still even like, a person anymore? And so I think it's a very powerful thing, this idea of lying down, because so much more than just lying down when you think of it in terms of how does the body, what does it mean to be revolutionary? I think normally we think of, someone standing up, moving, doing things, revolutionary isn't someone who just lies down, um, and stays put. In this case, of course, she's making eye contact with you, which is a little different than this, but I think still the lying down part is very powerful. And here he's pointing at a fish. And I think it's pretty, you can relate that to foodlessness, or to, the Straits of Florida. I think it's really hard to look at a dead fish in the hands of a Cuban and not think, okay, this is something that could be awaiting you if you jump into the Straits of Florida and try to cross into the United States. So a lot of double entendre, if you will, double meaning. So that was 2 + 2 = 5. Certainly an interesting artist to write about, and it will be interesting to see what happens with his career. I think all these pictures will only like enhance his career in the future when people look back and say, "Hey, what were you doing during this time? I was taking my artwork to the street and making these powerful pictures." By the way, I just noticed that the fish has like a hook or maybe even a fish line, perhaps connecting to it. So maybe it implies that this guy fished, actually went fishing for this fish. But let's see some art by Euler Perez now, who's another artist we've seen already. It says there's a constant need for supplies that he sometimes can't find in Cuba. The kind of paint the artist needs to work are not easy to come by. So, having to do the most with as little as you can, I think, is what's going on here. And you can probably guess why blue and red are the most available colors in Cuba. Well, that's the colors of the Cuban flag. So just that alone, to use blue and red means that blue and red, but it's probably used to either paint street signs like the ones you see above, or to paint the Cuban flag everywhere. He's almost reinventing those colors and now painting with colors that were meant to kind of reinforce nationalism, now to kind of reinvent nationalism in terms of the day-to-day reality of, street dog accepting the fact that his bowl is empty. Of course, the fact that he's painting his name, his signature on the wall, I think is a real, you can't overlook the power of claiming his own work, giving some kind of connection to the authorship of the work. And I think that does seem to imply that he's outside the revolution, that this is a moment of being outside the revolution or against it, or at least outside it. I don't want to say against it, because I think if he didn't have a signature there, then that would imply almost like he might be afraid of getting caught. But I do think that implies to me that he doesn't feel as much danger about getting caught, either because the work has already been neutered. It's not as incendiary as it could be, or just that he knows that there's no real willpower by the government to police at the sort of micro level, all these kind of these examples of art. And I think it's just a matter of the art not crossing a line into being too rabble rousing or too propagandistic. And I think that's a good thing. It's not, and I think when like my example, I would think of Diego Rivera, uh, famous Mexican muralist. His artwork was destroyed in New York because he included a picture of Lenin and Vladimir Lenin from the Soviet Union. And it's so sad that you can't go to New York and see a mural by Diego Rivera. And it's the only reason why is because he really wanted to stick to his guns and make sure that Vladimir Lenin was included in the mural. And Lenin, I think it's great that he stuck to his guns and stood up for his own integrity. But at the same time, like, Lenin is so kind of obsolete now that it's like, who cares? No one really like Lenin is not as important as maybe the bigger picture of like communism versus capitalism. And he could have achieved that bigger picture without needing Lenin in the picture. But he really wanted to have Lenin in the picture. And for me, it's just kind of like a great example of, well, yeah, but that's the dilemma of using politics in your art. It's sort of it makes it feel dated, the longer you get from it. And I think the beauty of these examples of street art is there's a timelessness to it, a universal quality to it. And I think that timelessness only gets richer and richer as time goes on. So here, the same artist, we're going to see his work move forward chronologically in a moment, but maybe we'll take a break in a second. But you can see two figures fighting over one drumstick. that's really powerful stuff. This is what I'm talking about when it comes to like, there's no Che Guevara, there's no Donald Trump, there's no Fidel Castro, and yet it's so political without being political, right? You've got two figures fighting over food, so it means scarcity of food. And almost someone, I don't know if he added this, but you see the water there. There's a watery kind of ceiling there. So it almost implies even if you get the food, you're still drowning. And, to reduce his work to this very iconic level where it's just these two figures fighting for food is, that's really powerful, more powerful, than anything than this, for instance. There's a wonderful critique of capitalism, maybe people clamoring. It's almost a very similar picture. A bunch of people fighting for $1 that's on fire, right? And that's powerful. I think it's a really deep message. It's not super political. It's very much about the nature of capitalism without it necessarily criticizing, presidential politics or being too like kind of propagandistic. But I think it's even more powerful in Cuba because, of course, people really are dealing with foodlessness and real scarcity and real struggle. So to offer a kind of sense of here's what's going on, we're not getting enough food. And of course, the red color is very much symbolic of the government. So these are, I think, really powerful pictures. And if you remember, we saw Antonia Itis, her kind of grotesque, if you will, pictures of the community, the Cuban, her neighbors. That defeatist imagery is what Leonard got her into a lot of trouble. Well, I think this artist likewise is kind of, well, this artist is using the same kind of, what would you call it? Kind of unflattering figures, unflattering colors, and maybe an inadvertent homage to Antonia Itis. But in a way, we'll get to her in a moment. But in a way, I think really fitting for the world we live in now compared to, or Cuba lives in now, Cubans live in now compared to the 1960s. So I think we've really come full circle here where this might have gotten him in trouble in 1950, 60, 1961, but now I think is such a just fitting mirror image of how Cubans are dealing. It's almost like it's these are visualizations of Cubans, the body is suffering, and this is a visualization of that suffering. The kind of what we call it, kind of warped bodies, and two people kind of looking at someone's body being warped. It seems like maybe a visualization of how you feel on the inside in Cuba. And certainly one way of interpreting it. I haven't seen green yet, so it's interesting this use of green versus red. Um, yeah, I guess well you get green from yellow and blue, so he must have maybe blue and then found yellow um, to get green. But certainly something to think about with the kind of symbolism of green. And again, he's still signing his name there. And here too, the figures kind of really lowered over like an overbred dog. Um, a person who's I think the implication here is like I've sacrificed, I've produced so much for the revolution, and now I'm left at a state of kind of begging um, for food, perhaps reaching out. Same kind of decay, color of decay that we see, I think, in the examples on the left by the more millennial artists we saw last week. Um, and this, I think, is more, the propaganda on the left, everything's fine, is, the official truth of the government. And then this ground level drawing on the right is a real truth by a real Cuban visualizing the day-to-day struggle. And that's why I think it's the posters like these just feel so kind of out of step with reality and are just, a real use of public art and art to lie, right? To lie directly to someone's face without blinking, without flinching. And that's the real frightening reality for me that you're supposed to just to fake it, how that hollows out your soul when from the government down, you're sort of just meant to pretend like you're happy. And that basically means when you sort of are meant or are supposed to play pretend, that means your own inner world is silenced, like your own self-expression has to be shut down because you're basically being told what you really see is not what matters. 2 + 2 = 5, right? That's really what this, I think, billboard is saying. 2 + 2 = 5. Of course, saying it differently, right? So let's take a short break and we'll pick up off where we left off here. And I'll see you guys back in about 5 minutes. And I think you'd agree that this is a very much more, I think, political picture than the other examples. Here, of course, the flag, I think, is exactly what I'm talking about. When you add imagery that's more propagandistic, you kind of cross the line, not crossing a line, but maybe you push your work to a point where you might get more, negative feedback from the government, right? Because now you're using state uh, iconography of the state, right? So the flag itself is much more direct than using the colors of the flag, for instance, right? So, here we're using the colors of the flag, but we're not using the flag. So that's what I'm talking about when it comes to, finding examples where you're being political without being using political imagery. And here is an example where I think if you do use political imagery, you are now crossing from a place of kind of perhaps transcendence or hold on just a moment. Dog barking up outside to kind of being a little more precise and I think clear about your critical criticism of the government. I think it's quite self-evident. The flag is not just uh, plunge, marked into the body or penetrating the body. It's bleeding. The body is bleeding, and the person's looking up at the flag, I guess almost in a state of disbelief might be though, they're not outraged, but they're kind of reacting to the flag. And of course, they don't have arms. So clearly, whoever put the flag into the person's body is not the person itself. So I think the armlessness for me is one of the wonderful parts of the picture because it implies that the subject didn't impale himself with the flag, but that someone else stuck the flag into the person. Now, maybe there are arms and I don't see them here, but I'm just kind of interpreting this what I see. And it also looks like we're in a kind of, if you will, a outdoor gallery of different pictures. You can see the one on the far left. So maybe this is like some abandoned building and a place where he can paint pictures that are a little more perhaps aggressive and get away with it because they're not so visible as perhaps something like this, which is right on the street, and of course not like this, which is literally, meant to be visible. So these, I think, are more personal, kind of private responses that are pushing the boundaries a little more and done so in a place that's a little off the beaten path. Although he does still sign his name, so I think that that's still something to consider. Is that meant to just sort of say, so what if you catch me? I don't care. Or maybe his name is enough of a nom de guerre, an artist name where it doesn't connect to the individual. And yet, even so, to sign your name, I think is a real standoffish thing, especially, given the subject here. And, does seem to have a resemblance to something we've seen before. Last week, you saw Carlos Martial impaled by flags. Of course, conspicuously absent is a Cuban flag. And I don't think that's a criticism of him here because I think he's got a much more important critique of history of colonization, slavery, and other things that I think it would it would be a distraction in his case, or maybe even a form of kind of self-indulgent to kind of criticize the government when I think he's got a much more important kind of message that transcends Cuba. And I think part of the power of Carlos Martial's work is that he's kind of transcending in a way you could say he's outside the revolution because his work still speaks the kind of language of standing up against imperialism, but doing so beyond in a way that grows beyond the revolution. So in a way, he's like a Che Guevara who's left Cuba and is talking about this sort of bigger picture of revolution as it relates to the world and not just Cuba. And so I think in his case, he's kind of another example where it's not so much about being within the revolution, but transcending it and still using kind of propagandistic language, but doing so in a way that's, of course, not going to necessarily get him in trouble. It would, of course, if he's put the Cuban flag there, but that wouldn't really make sense because his critique is about colonization. And for all the criticism of the Cuban government, you can't really accuse it of colonizing other places. I mean, I don't think so, but I think it would be inappropriate to replace the Union Jack, the British flag, with the Cuban flag. Whereas in this case, of course, I think it, much more personal critique and more of a critique of, the everyday Cuban life and the Cuban government. Whereas this, I think, is more of a comment on the, institutional slavery, colonization, and the, effects of history on the present day. But he's not necessarily meant to be a symbol for the average Cuban person here. I think Carlos Martillo is more of a symbol of the effects of slavery and the kind of legacies of slavery and colonization. And remember, Antoniaitis here, of course, is the kind of picture that landed her into trouble, forced her into early retirement because her pictures were quote unquote defeatist, a kind of unflattering picture of Cuba, holding a mirror up to her neighbors, literally. But of course, it's a very different world here in the days of Julia Perez in the late 2000s, or I mean, sorry, early 20th century, or getting into the early 21st century. And here you can see now we've got a painting on a canvas. So I think this maybe implies that he's reached a level of, it's not like the pure, look at the canvas, you see halfway down, it's sort of kind of literally woven together. So it looks like, maybe an exception to the rule. And I think the canvas here speaks to the fact that it's not something you just go to, whatever, the art supply store and buy a canvas. You got to really make it, put it together the same way people put together rafts to leave Cuba. An artist has to put together a canvas in order to express himself or herself or their self. And in this case, I think you can see a kind of page torn out of the Antonia Itis playbook with kind of references to the police state there. Um, and now you're going to see some of his work as it evolves from, I think, and here we've got a reference back to one of the other ones, very Banksy kind of stencil version of his um, foodlessness icon, foodless icon. And I think we're going to start going chronologically in a moment. These are more works, of course, by Julia Perez, likewise here. And so here is an example of, you can do this. You could say, communism hates liberty. That's what it says. And yet it's so propagandistic and so kind of clear, and words are so, valuable for communication, but, they are so precise and specific that it, just, it's propaganda one way or the other. And you're much better showing rather than telling, I think, when it comes to art. But I think this speaks to his other underlying kind of disgust for the government, or at least communism, at least as it relates to Cuba. Although in this case, it seems like he's pretty much condemning communism for its sort of hatred, quote unquote, of liberty. But I think that's fueling his artwork here. And I think, some of us might be more supportive of communism than others, but I think we can be so without denying his right to kind of be critical, and that's great. So here, I think in some cases he's putting up little stones with drawings, paintings on them, and then removing them, but doing this just for the sake of taking the photograph and sharing it online. And I think you'll see why he does that, because they're a little more confrontational than I think these pictures, which are much more universalized and just sort of, the sense of outrage or concern that you see here, I think is meant to reinforce the feelings that people have. The average Cuban looking, around at the world with a profound sense of concern. When are they going to get the next meal? Likewise, here, the street dog is a symbol for the day-to-day struggle of people. Obviously, not afraid to sit and pose with artwork. Here we are in 2017. This is, of course, before the pandemic, but of course, a year after the death of Fidel Castro. Now we move to 2020. This is the year of the pandemic. So this is definitely when Cuba starts losing a lot of tourism and a lot of morale because of the way the pandemic really strengthens the government. People were protesting in 2020. And so I think he is reacting for sure to some of the protests going on over the lack of food and just a general malaise. There were protests in the United States in 2020. So it's not like, it's unique to Cuba, but a different kind of protest, right? And of course, a bomb waiting to explode. I think it's, this is powerful, but for me, not as powerful as reaching up for food that's out of reach. For me, that says the same thing as this. But this is much more political and more propagandistic. The flag, that's always, by definition, kind of more clear and precise and nationalistic, propagandistic language, and now kind of overlapping with the government's monopoly on, iconic imagery. Here we are in 2023, likewise, food, I think, is a major theme of his work. And you don't see that, Banksy, for all of his merit, doesn't talk about food scarcity, or how are you going to get the next meal. So he's definitely addressing concerns that are more first world concerns, and that's not at all a criticism, but I think you really have to understand this picture wouldn't have be received the same way if it was in New York City, because this is directly, I think, about it making the external body resemble the internal sense of either scavenging or fighting for resources, and the way having to scavenge for food dehumanizes people, and that might be precisely the point. So this is a very powerful way of criticizing perhaps the government strategy of making people fight for each other for resources, so that at least it doesn't fight against the government. Here's an example of him, a rare example of him delving, or at least a rare, as far as I've seen, of him delving into abstraction. And yet it's not abstraction when you, of course, think about the idea of looking at the horizon and contemplating the idea of leaving Cuba, going across the ocean to reach Florida, that ocean representing both a causeway, but also a wall, a geographical wall, a barrier. So I think that same kind of idea is somewhat on display here, with the pool being a kind of grotesque mirror of the impassibility of Cubans to leave Cuba and to benefit from all the dream of Miami. And here, literally fighting over, food versus smartphone and the flag, and a lot more heavy-handed imagery. And it's powerful, but for me, still not as powerful as this, because it just, again, for all the reasons I've gone into. But you can see he's definitely getting more confrontational, using more imagery that's very recognizable as we get to the present day. So I'd say he's pushing buttons, pushing the boundaries. Here's an example of him taking a picture of something that would probably be removed after he leaves. That's the National Palace, by the way, I'm pretty sure, in Havana. Welcome to Cuba. I think we heard a reference to an art historian talking about art world coming to Cuba to drink their mojito while wearing a Che Guevara t-shirt. Well, here, I think this is really meant for tourists. Welcome to Cuba. It's meant, of course, to be ironic. And here is very kind of the most political yet, a police officer dangling food as a way of controlling people. It's very, once you start, illustrating the police as kind of monsters, and you see pairs of police officers on every street corner, almost every street corner at Havana, now you're really pushing buttons. And that's why I think he's putting these works of art on little pieces of rubble, rather than on the wall, which would definitely get him into trouble. And then, of course, now he's branching off into these installations with street, some kind of figure who's we don't see sleeping on the streets, and you can, interpret this however you'd like. I just kind of want to show you the evolution of his work as he kind of shifts gears here and there. Starts making T-shirts. I think Keith Haring is not the worst comparison. Um, so, if you're interested in writing about this artist, you might consider comparing his work to Keith Haring. He just looks like a child sitting in the rubble, maybe a fetus. Um, I do like the idea of painting onto the rubble. That's a very powerful way of commercializing his work. Imagine him selling these pieces to tourists. That would be kind of ironic too. And now we end with Maisel Lopez, who is a great contrast to what we've seen, because I think he's an artist who's trained by the revolution, trained in the art schools of the revolution, San Alejandro, very young artist, and commissioned to make these murals that we'll see. This itself, this is expression. I don't know if it's universal. I think we understand this to be like, shh, like be quiet. Um, and that's, really powerful choice, and especially as it relates to Cuba or other countries where there's censorship, even in the United States, telling someone to be quiet is almost like, be quiet for the sake of everyone else, because maybe it's a quiet place like a library, but also you can interpret it as like, be quiet or I'll beat you up, be quiet. I'm telling you to be quiet because I have the power to silence you. Or maybe it's a way of saying be quiet because you might get into trouble. So it's maybe warning you and saying, hey, be careful because if you cross the line, you might get into trouble. So very powerful decision to just show yourself, being silent or silencing yourself, silencing others. Um, and you might think about how that relates to this work that we're going to see now. Like Chuck Close, for instance, these hyper realistic, photorealistic paintings from the 1970s. They're very powerful, but for me, it is way more powerful because of the context, and I think comes from a society reeling with real concerns about day-to-day struggle, whereas Chuck Close is kind of in that kind of ivory tower of art for art's sake, which is great, and I think a real sign that society is a healthy place where people can kind of indulge in monumental portraits. Um, Very in your face, but I think a sign of a society, a healthy society, at least kind of with a no concern about, where the next cigarette is going to come from. Even in Cuba, if you paint someone smoking a cigarette, people might be like, oh, you can afford cigarettes, right? So it's, very subtle little choices amount to a lot, depending on society, depending on the time you're alive. And now we get to this question I think is so interesting. I would imagine that to make these paintings, Maisel Lopez had to go through some approval process, and he maybe offered the idea of painting portraits of children as a way to heighten morale in a time of despair because children represent innocence and purity and the future. And so, in a way, you're focusing on the future rather than the past, and even kind of saying, let's get out of the present day struggle and be reminded of the importance of the next generation and being hopeful about that because children are still going to have to grow up. And if even though we have a lot of struggle, you kind of have to focus on the positive. And any parent, I think, will do that in a time of struggle. You're going to want to try to convince your child that everything's fine, that there's a sense of hope, even if you feel a sense of despair. And yet, I think it's tricky because, if we're talking about children, we're also kind of hiding behind that innocence as a shield to perhaps, not criticize the day-to-day struggle. So in a way, we're looking at the total opposite end of the spectrum as someone like 2 + 2 = 5 or Julia Perez, because they're addressing foodlessness, whereas this is not about eating the butterflies, but rather about, well, you tell me, any thoughts on what is the message of this painting? Is it optimistic? And if so, what is optimistic about this picture? Says, and yeah, Joss. I think I got a message from Joss. That's great, Joss. No worries. Does anyone have any idea? Is this a positive? I think by definition, it has to be a positive picture because it's, the flag. But in this case, maybe the flag transforming into butterflies. You could say this is maybe this flag disintegrating into its component parts. So there may be a veiled criticism here. But I think overall, the idea is the kids holding the flag in a supportive way, and the fact that and I think a celebration of the individual component parts of the country, the child being one of them, looking directly at you. And so I think this is a case of being within the revolution, not pushing too many buttons, and offering a kind of positive spin on the day-to-day life. There's eerie resemblance to some of the propaganda we've seen. I think the context matters here, of course. But like, the flag, for instance, here, Fidel Castro is in black and white or sepia, whereas the words are in bright red. So here the girl is in black and white, but the butterflies are in bright color. So, I think there's a real resemblance to this, but I think it's still, I think the picture on the right for me is a lot more powerful and less propagandistic and more timeless, more universalized, maybe with the exception of the flag on the butterfly. But I think the picture on the right is much more closer to the reality matching the day-to-day life than the one on the left, which is just so one-dimensional and propagandistic and Fidel oriented. This, at least, we can kind of see the child as like a symbolic of every child. And she's smiling. So there's maybe just kind of and she's like eye level with you. So you're kind of brought down to child's perspective on the world. And so that I think is the real power of these pictures, that you're brought to a child's perspective and not necessarily you're lifting up people to Fidel Castro's perspective. So I think that is powerful. The butterfly seems like a very, personalized symbol for the artists here. The blank slate, I think the blank space is very powerful. It almost implies like the future is unwritten, so it could be bad, could be good, is up to you. So there's a kind of a maybe a powerful affirmation of your individual ability to fill out the blank spaces of the future. Um, but I think it really depends. I think here a kid reacting to the butterfly is, somewhat timeless. But I think this is where I think Banksy, you really have to consider the Banksy effect on globalized art. And I think you see that, people making art in Gaza to bring awareness to the suffering of people. I do think Banksy's floating around the background of the art world today. Um, both as a street artist, but someone who's criticizing the institutions. And I think even the subject matter is very much kind of somewhat in dialogue with Banksy. When you think about his work here, for instance, like I think the Balloon Girl is so kind of ubiquitous now. I think even Banksy, shredded his own version of Balloon Girl at Sotheby's. So, here I think Banksy himself is might be responding to like Jeff Koons, who's not my favorite artist. Um, and I think kind of uses childhood in a way that kind of is very different than this, which is very much about this innocent moment that we've all kind of been through with what do you do with a balloon that you purchase, at the park? Do you release it? Do you bring it home? Do you pop it? Do you play with it? Very universal experience, but I think probably experienced by every child in the whole world. But I think, using the balloon as a kind of symbol of what enjoyment, personal expression, having fun, being a child, and you might interpret this as it relates to, this is not a mural commissioned. This is also by Manuel Lopez using probably more of a mural, a canvas here. But I think this is almost like the code that speaks to his underlying feelings about Cuba. Here's a child holding a book, a red book that says Sueños, which is dreams. So it's kind of like a page from the Sandra Ramos pictures we saw a few weeks ago. I guess the book of dreams is a closed book that the child's clutching, and it almost implies that his dreams are just on paper, but not in reality, because reality, of course, is a world that's been inundated by a flood, and he's barely hanging on to a piece of what floating, part of society that I think is Havana in the background because you see the Capitol building there. So I think this speaks to kind of another message that perhaps is important supplement or complement to this, but this is more like within the revolution, and this is more of a critique, I think, of the revolution. And this isn't something I think you would see on a mural, and maybe rightly so, because, I think a mural is more about a community space and speaking to communal interests rather than individual interests. Not always, but I think in this case, it's more, this is the artist commenting on, a lot of young kids growing up and the reality not matching maybe the dreams that you read about as a child. And all of us kind of go through that, as a kid, you have your dreams, and then reality as an adult might feel more like what this kid is dealing with here. Of course, he's sleeping, so, that maybe, or maybe even dead, the other ways to interpret this. And even this, it's hard for me to look at this and not think, okay, it's a nice kind of happy interaction between a kid and a fish, but, maybe this is saying like, if you cross the streets of Florida, you might perish and end up underwater. So, and it's hard for me not to think about this as being a veiled criticism of the future that might await many children who end up growing up to be adults who cross the straits of Florida without, reaching their destination in Florida. And so now we get back to the first picture we saw. And again, I think this is a lot of the benefits of, being kind of more less propagandistic, a child delighting in the butterfly. Um, again, still kind of like still eerily resembles Banksy to me. It's of course not a stencil, but I do think there's a kind of dialogue with Banksy here. But for me, the worst part about this is the Fidel Castro, which feels like an afterthought and totally out of place, and almost for me tells me that someone whispered to the artist, like, "Hey, this is great. I love your work, but where's Fidel?" Like you need to put Fidel somewhere. And I think that's the real kind of maybe something that to me implies there's someone overlooking and supervising and saying, look, if you want to keep benefiting from having all these paints and the public space to work on, you better show a little bit of allegiance here. And I think that might be what's going on. I'm not sure, but it does seem like an afterthought to have Fidel Castro, almost like he gave the girl a hat just so he could give her Fidel Castro, because otherwise, where else could he put Fidel Castro and justify it? So, I do think this is a case with being within the revolution. And I think that, of course, that's a really interesting to think about when you guys look at the artwork and the artists you guys are looking at. How do you stay within the revolution? And it's not like being within the revolution is bad necessarily, but I think it really, you have to think about, as an artist, being revolutionary might mean revolutionary because the government's telling you what to do and the government's revolutionary, or redefining what it means to be revolutionary. So, that's up for you guys to think about with your papers. And now here, a kid looking at a balloon, again, I can't help but think about the Banksy impact on subject matter, on childhood, looking at the world from the point of view of a child. And of course, in this case, it's a little unclear. The balloon is almost like a symbol of childhood, contemplating the balloon. But of course, the nuclear power, the physics, the nucleus with the electrons flying around the proton, is that what it's called? Electron, proton, neutron. I think that's right. It's been a while since I've been in high school. And I think maybe an affirmation of science and wonder. And nothing heavily propagandistic here. So, this feels more outside the revolution than, say, this. Um, and there's a certain appeal because of this. It leaves a lot more to room for wonder, and makes it feel like the child is just a child and not necessarily just a spokesperson for the revolution. And I think, something like this is in Cuba. This, has a lot different meaning, a gun with a flower in it than perhaps, a protester with a, Molotov cocktail replaced by a bouquet of flowers, which is Banksy. So certainly Banksy, the equivalent of Banksy in Cuba, like this, I think wouldn't necessarily make as much sense in Cuba as perhaps, this, because of course it's not about, this isn't intended to raise morale so much as maybe talk about a child contemplating a bird, maybe a kid growing up in a city, looking at nature. And of course it's the stencil, so it's done really quickly. So it almost implies that there's like a, reclaiming public space here. Whereas this for me is much more, what you would do in Cuba. A milk carton is much more than a milk carton. It's like a symbol of foodlessness and scarcity, and having, this as a subject really speaks to the scarcity that Cubans feel on a day-to-day basis. So I think it's really important to, when you think about Banksy, you have to understand how he's speaking to a certain kind of dilemma within the art world, a critique of the art world in the United States, Europe, and beyond. Whereas these artists in Cuba are really holding up a mirror to everyday Cubans and saying, hey, we're all in this struggle together. We're all feeling it. And I think that makes the work really powerful. And when we look back at this era, I think these artists are really going to benefit from these bold works of art that they're making. Even if the work of art disappears, the pictures will last forever. And I think these will be the next age of artist icons that they look back to and say, hey, what were you doing during this time? Did you leave Cuba? Did you stay in Cuba? What did you do if you stayed in Cuba? And it will be very interesting for me to see if these millennial artists who, benefit from traveling freely from Cuba, exhibiting their work in London, New York, Miami, Japan, wherever else, whether or not they kind of find some kind of nexus with these street artists, and that brings them back into being in touch with your everyday Cuban, because I think that's the real ultimate measurement of an artist's value, is how they're speaking to the needs and concerns of everyday Cubans, rather than necessarily being in dialogue with the art world, right? So I think these are all really important concerns to think about when you come to writing your paper, if you're writing about an artist who's kind of dealing with the more recent concerns in the last few decades. But if you're writing about, say, Raul Martinez or other young artists from a different era, you might have to think about how that era relates to their artwork, whether or not they're, in this honeymoon period of the revolution, whether or not they're kind of artists who were born under the revolution and born after the revolution, and of course how they're, navigating this idea of making art that's revolutionary and how you define the word revolution, and whether or not that's revolutionary needs to be propagandistic. And I think today we've seen a lot of examples of art that's revolutionary, but not in the sense of like take to the streets and protest, but rather revolutionary because it's maybe holding up a mirror and offering some value to the average person. And maybe it's revolutionary to show empathy and to show sympathy. And that's, I think, a very powerful thing to think about, that revolution can be just a matter of compassion and not necessarily violence and propaganda. And that's not to say that they're both valid and valuable, but I think it's just something to think about as you write your papers and just move forward with your own sense of ethics as an artist and a desire to be activist as an artist. You can kind of you can serve society by kind of coming up with your own iconography, because at the very minimum, that might affirm your own sense of self and autonomy. And once you do that, you're affirming everyone else's sense of self and autonomy. And I think it's great to have a world full of, individual agents who are autonomous, who kind of are architects of their own destiny rather than sheep who are kind of just following the fashions and trends and trying to emulate and copy others rather than kind of speak some sort of inner truth that we all have. So on that note, I'll be very sad to not see you guys next week, and to not have this class anymore. But I think it's been a really exciting and valuable kind of journey within Cuba to see this very interesting kind of progression from, the early days of Cuba onto the present day. And I do think it's a time of uncertainty, but also, I think looking back down the road, you'll be really appreciative to have gotten this kind of view of Cuba, because, who knows what will come, but certainly these artists will become all the more valuable as time kind of adds that golden glow to the past. I will miss you guys this summer, but do keep in touch. If you go to Cuba and you need some contacts, or if you just have anything in Cuba related, you have the way to reach me. But otherwise, I wish you guys a great summer. I'm looking forward to reading your papers. You can have right up until the last day to turn in your paper, and just and I won't give you a final exam, just maybe one or two questions about the class to give me some feedback. And thank you for being such wonderful students and for being part of such a great class. Stop this recording.
Thank you so much.
You bet. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Dacia, and thank you, everyone else.
Hey, can I ask you something real quick?
Stop this recording. Go ahead.